Hello, my name is Patrick Corte. I'm coming from New York City. I was invited here by Larry to speak about participatory economics. And I work in the service industry for a coffee company. I've been working in the service industry since I started working when I was 15. And I'm currently in college studying history, my organizing experience. Won't bore anyone with that, but I'm a member of the Left Labor Project and the Organization for a Free Society, which is a political group that advocates some of the ideas I'll be talking about today, in particular participatory socialism, of which I would consider participatory economics a component. So I'm not here presenting any original theory or any original idea. This didn't spring out of my head. I consider that myself to be presenting and summarizing certain lessons that have been learned from the actual struggles of people over the course of the last 200 or 300 years, and various attempts that have been made to draw specific lessons from those struggles regarding both the nature of the system that we're up against, as well as what we should actually be fighting for in terms of a more just and free economy and a more just and free society. There's a few terms I wanted to define very quickly, because in order for us to talk about any of these things in an intelligent and practical way, I think it's important for us to be clear about certain terms. And several that were mentioned today that I thought were worth perhaps providing alternative definitions for, or specific definitions for, include reform, revolution, radical, class society, and socialism. Since I'm short on time, I was going to hopefully make this more participatory, but to just sort of breeze through things, there's been this discussion of not waiting for the revolution, but this needs to really be defined. What precisely does this mean? So a revolution and a reform, right, are often the dichotomy that's presented within left circles, reform or revolution. Well, what is a reform? Does anyone have a quick answer to that? A reform?
A modification to the current system.
Exactly, to the current system. So then what is a revolution? So overturning of a certain set of social relations, right? And replacing them with other forms of social institutions, correct?
Forcibly.
Forcibly? Not necessarily. We can talk about that, but sure, that can be part of it. So, to sort of paraphrase Cornelius Castoriadis, he philosopher and economist, he said, roughly, revolution doesn't mean bloodshed, it doesn't mean terror, it doesn't mean the storming of the Winter Palace, it means a fundamental transformation, a radical transformation in social relations and social institutions that govern our lives. So then, if a revolution is a radical transformation in social institutions, what is radical? Does anyone know the Latin root of radical? Root. There we go. So to be radical means to go to the root. So a revolution is going to the root of causes of social injustice, oppression, and exploitation, uprooting them, and building society anew upon stronger roots and roots that we feel better enforce particular social values. Okay, so a few other terms. I guess I'll be quicker with these. Socialism. Socialism is a really general term. I would maybe perhaps like to distinguish between 20th century socialism and 21st century socialism, or participatory socialism, as I would prefer to call it. 20th century socialism could perhaps more accurately be called the dictatorship of the coordinator class. Those are, the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and all these so-called socialist countries ultimately eliminated private ownership of the means of production through nationalization, but essentially installed a new ruling class. This class's interests were not driven by the accumulation of profit, but over, the management of labor, the aggrandizement of their power. They ultimately monopolized empowering work, conceptual labor, and were responsible for the management of others' times in labor, and created horribly oppressive regimes that I'd say have absolutely nothing to do with, in the words of Marx, a society in which a precondition for the freedom of one is the freedom of all. So that, for me, is generally what socialism would mean. And I would also argue that participatory socialism would be a form of social organization in which, the precondition for the freedom of one is the freedom of all, and equality of circumstances and opportunities, and a society in which people directly participate in the management of governing social institutions. Rather than ruled from above, ultimately people, through association and through cooperation, directly manage society. So what does this mean for an economy? That would mean we want an economic system in which the means of production are held in common, people cooperatively negotiate their interrelated economic activities and reach an economic equilibrium that way with regards to supply and demand, instead of relying on market forces which produce individualism, antisocial behavior, destroy the environment, amongst other things. So I guess before I just overview the key features of a participatory economy, I wanted to use a metaphor that's used by a friend of mine. And I'm sorry if anyone here is familiar with, has heard Michael Albert speak or is familiar with any of his works, but oftentimes he'll start a talk out like this. Suppose I were to come to you today, and to describe to you a system that was so horrible, so destructive of human life, something that crushed us and ultimately eliminated our capacities to be truly free and peaceful human beings. I would describe this to you and ask you to join me in the movement against aging. You would think I was crazy, right? I would hope so. And this is a ridiculous example, perhaps. But the point being, aging is just a fact of life. It's not something that you can change, right? Any more than you can change gravity. And oftentimes, when people in America or around the world hear people on the left, hear people who identify as progressives or socialists or radicals, whatever, that's what they hear. They hear us asking them to join us in a movement against aging, against something that can't be stopped. And sometimes we ultimately fail to articulate a desirable alternative to the present system and to indicate pathways to obtain such a form of social organization. And I'd say that's one of the primary reasons that left ideas are completely marginalized in this society, not just because we have a system that clearly wants to see them stamped out for all eternity, but because we fail to provide people with something that they can actually envision as a feasible alternative, and we fail to provide programmatic steps in that direction. So, what is an economy? Production, allocation, and consumption. An economy produces items for consumption. So you produce things, you distribute them, you allocate inputs to produce them, and you consume them. So those are the core features of any economy, from feudalism to capitalism to the state socialist societies of the past to hopefully the participatory socialist societies of the future. And what is capitalism? It's a profit-driven, market-based means of accomplishing production, allocation, and consumption, and it's based on a hierarchical division of labor, private ownership of the means of production, in which a tiny minority Okay, well, I'm sorry. And I will be taking one more minute of everyone's time. So, capitalism's bad. And so what kind of economy do we want? I'll, again, in the session with me, I'll go into more detail about this, but I would say the starting point should be the articulation of core values, many of which were already mentioned here as soon as I walked in the door. I'm sure we can all name all of them in a brief go-around if we were to. We don't have enough time, and we call them different things. I'm going to call them solidarity, diversity, equity, self-management, and efficiency. Solidarity, we want an economy that ultimately crushes human potential and causes us to show absolutely no regard for our fellow human beings, or do we want one that promotes empathy, mutual aid, and solidarity? Diversity, do we want an economy that homogenizes and limits options or widens options, provides multiple forms of labor and items for consumption and ways of life for our people? Equity, this is more controversial. I'll go into it in my talk, but I would just say, what does equity mean? We want, fairness of circumstances. We want a just form of remuneration. Clearly, under capitalism, people are remunerated for ownership and power, right? Power, you get what you can take. It's based on bargaining power. We want to eliminate that. What would we want? What would an equitable form of remuneration be? That's one thing. Things that actually affect, under market economies, things that affect whole populations, like pollution, are not included because they're externalities, right? So the only thing that matters in a market economy is, I have money, you have a car, I'll buy your car. The carbon emissions produced from the consumption of that item doesn't matter. It doesn't factor in the equation. Profit is God under capitalism. So we want self-management. We want people to have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. And since I'm out of time and I don't want to monopolize this any more than I already have, there are several core institutions of a participatory economy, which would include grassroots participatory councils of workers and consumers to cooperatively negotiate their interrelated economic activities, jobs balanced for equity and for general fairness of circumstances so that rote and disempowering work is shared across society rather than being the labor of the overwhelming majority of people like me, and probably most of us in this room, and instead sharing that responsibility across society and opening opportunities for all to perform empowering and conceptual labor. And equitable remuneration, which I would say should be based upon remuneration for effort and sacrifice, and in certain cases need for those who can't work, as opposed to remuneration for either ownership, power, or output. And I guess last, to be controversial, I am a virulent opponent of market socialism and returns to a mythological past based on like self-sufficient economic production. I don't think that that's possible in a world that has, I don't think we can afford to maintain market allocation in a world with 6 billion people, and I think it's any less than the globalization of participatory self-management that is the free association of producers and consumers cooperatively negotiating economic results. Anything short of that is an abdication of our responsibility to the whole of humanity instead of to just the people we see perhaps on a day-to-day basis, because I don't think that we need to essentially discard the worst parts of modern industrial society, destroy class society in all its forms, and build a new world on participatory and democratic and just lines.
Larry has asked me to take staff